But as premillennialism conflict ends, there's another conflict that begins, and I think in some respects, even though we're moving from a theological conflict to more of a sociological conflict, although there's theology there as well, these two things are, I think, very closely connected. So we move from talking about a premillennialism controversy to talking about a controversy that develops over the question of institutionalization. And what kind of institutions can a church support? That both of these questions are related to how churches of Christ, kind of split from the disciples of Christ. The disciples are trying to present themselves as the more mainstream, fit in with the rest of American Christianity. And churches of Christ are trying to establish their identity, kind of as counter to that, and calling people to the restoration of Christianity instead of just kind of a variety of denominations all going towards the same direction. But as churches of Christ make their way through the 20th century, they begin to build a variety of institutions. Educational institutions, benevolent institutions, things that we've seen in the 19th century, the early 20th century, and a lot of this will lead to conflict over what can a church do, what can a church support, what can the funds gathered by a congregation, how can they be used, and how can congregations work together? All of those questions that are really coming to the forefront in the 20th century in Churches of Christ result in what's known as the non-institutionalism movement, or the institutionalism controversy in the 20th century. Now, remember that in the 19th century, Alexander Campbell starts off in the Christian Baptist as being very opposed to any sort of institutionalizing of Christianity. So he's against missionary societies, he's against denominational boards, he's against a lot of church hierarchy, bless you, because he believes that there is not scriptural evidence to support those kinds of institutions. But eventually, by the 1830s, 1840s, he is supportive of the idea of churches cooperating together especially to work on missions. But as the American Christian Missionary Society developed, as we talked about, there was that opposition to that institutional framework. That what a lot of people who tend to be more southern, more rural, lower class, what they tended to see in the Missionary Society was the first steps towards a denominational type of structure, which is the kind of thing that they had abandoned when they left the Baptist Church, the Presbyterian Church, etc. And especially after the Civil War, because of the actions of some northern Christians in the Restoration movement, there was an even greater opposition to the Missionary Society in the 19th century. Now, it's that strand that in the break becomes the strand that is Churches of Christ. So, out of this strand that is anti-institutional, there will eventually be, another side of institutionalization. And there are a couple of different ways that this is prevalent. Now, one way that you begin to see institutionalization in the Churches of Christ is something that is beginning to produce itself in a variety of Christian groups, and that is the existence of the Sunday school. Sunday schools didn't exist in Christianity until the late 17th century. the late 18th century, the late 1700s. Now, certainly, Christians had taught other Christians, the Bible was read, there was an educational component to Christianity, especially in the collective worship, but as a distinct movement separate from the collective worship service, there wasn't the notion of what we think of today with the Sunday schools. Especially any type of age segregation where you have a division between adults, teenagers, what we today would call elementary school age. And so this is something that really develops in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 19th century. Starts predominantly in England and then will eventually spread to America. Now, those early Sunday schools, in England especially, were not solely focused on religious education. That was a key component of the Sunday schools. But largely the focus was on trying to help lower class children develop certain social skills that were important for health and for socialization in society. So, teaching about hygiene and teaching manners. These were some of the things that were an important part of those early Sunday schools. The essential thought behind this was that as these children become more educated, just in general, about life, that they would become Christians because they become educated, they become enlightened. And so they would see how important Christianity was to society. Ultimately, this was a social project where the Bible becomes a textbook for a better life and becomes a way to find success, to be a part of society, those kind of things. And the reason for the Sunday school was that during the week, a lot of children in this time period were engaged in work. They were economic contributors to their families. Excuse me. So that Sunday was really the only time there was to try and impart some of this learning, impart some of these skills to children, because for the rest of the week they were working, and they were working sometimes these 31 hours. As the Sunday school movement makes its way to the United States, there is a transformation that takes place where the early Sunday schools in England had not been so much about spiritual formation of the spiritual life, there's certainly character formation, but there's not as much focus on spiritual life. In the United States, it becomes much more about salvation, spiritual formation, education in the knowledge of the Bible, not just how the Bible can help you live a better life. Now, a lot of this has to do with ways in which there is this transition that's taking place with how conservative Protestants especially, or evangelicals, are thinking about children. On the one hand, they have this viewpoint that they have inherited from their Calvinist background, that children are born depraved, that they're born in original sin. But by the 17th century and the 18th century, there are new views developing about children that are starting to kind of modify this. So when John Locke in the 17th century, for example, starts some of his teachings about how we get ideas, how we gain knowledge, people began to look upon children not as depraved or born with original sin even though they still claim that because they believe that that was a, that they're shaped by that Calvinist doctrine. And actually, original sin was an older doctrine than Calvin. But from Protestants, mostly have been shaped by Calvin. So anyway, so they have that as a theological viewpoint, but they're shaped by Locke and others who are talking about children as blank slates. So this idea of children are born innocent, and it's important to cultivate them and shape their lives so that they evidence Christian character throughout, instead of necessarily thinking about them in the context of depravity. Additionally, there's also this influence of this rejection of the Enlightenment that is known as Romanticism, which was a philosophical movement that affected not just philosophy, but art and science and other things as well, that is beginning to shape Christian thinking of children as these kind of spiritual innocents, that they're actually closer to God, etc. So the Sunday schools are meant to kind of address this idea of, spiritual formation, education, these lifelong processes, and so in America it becomes more about this idea. And so here's this concern of wanting to educate children, develop them, help them progress spiritually, and so the Sunday schools really participate as part of this. Now, this fits in then to the benevolent empire in the 19th century, in that the benevolent empire is developing all these societies. Well, one of them was the American Sunday School Union. And the American Sunday School Union was an attempt to try and bring some uniformity across denominations regarding the curriculum taught in Sunday schools. And so there is this attempt to try and standardize curriculum, develop curriculum that could be used by a wide variety of Protestant denominations to try and educate children. Now, the American Sunday School Union started in 1824, so it's starting at this time period where Stone and Campbell are kind of at their height. Originally, they're opposed to the American Sunday School Union. They're not necessarily opposed to Sunday schools, but they are opposed to the society because they feel like this is just one more denominational type of structure. It's more fostering division. It's supporting denominationalism rather than Christian unity. But Stone, on the other hand, likes the idea of using the Sunday school to teach poor, particularly poor children, how to read. And so he thinks there's a benefit there. But the structure that Protestants are trying to put together, he feels is not as useful. That's the 1820s. By the 1840s, though, there is an effort alongside the American Christian Missionary Society to try and form a Sunday school society that is going to help provide and promote Sunday school programs in churches. So by the 1840s, there is this kind of institutionalizing of Sunday schools in churches, in the Restoration movement, where there had been opposition. Eventually, many states started with Restoration movement members in various states started Sunday school state organizations. These ideas were promoted by Isaac Eric, John McGarvey, a lot of those people we talked about in the 19th century. Well, you have on the one hand this Protestant attempt to produce materials and train teachers, very institutional type of concept. And the Restoration movement largely they're wanting to produce their own literature instead of using that produced like by the Sunday School Union. And a lot of the focus is the study of the Bible. Eventually, the Disciples of Christ, as the split occurs, the Disciples of Christ would go on, form a publishing house. They would even be one of the first schools and religious groups to develop in their colleges a religious education major, where people could major in religious education, whether that would be focused on a Sunday school program or private Christian schools, something like that. So that's the trajectory of the disciples. Our focus goes more on the churches of Christ. And so by the 20th century, many churches of Christ had supported and were using the Sunday school, this idea of separating people by age groups. But a variety of concerns developed among churches of Christ.
So Sunday school, they started that, the Disciples of Christ?
No. It started in the 18th century over in England and come over to the United States.
Oh, really? Is that all?
Yeah. And so the disciples are kind of like participating in this, but instead of using the literature that a lot of like the Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians tended to use the same literature to teach these Sunday schools, they're starting their own literature, and they eventually, the disciples will become much more institutional in doing that. Because of holding on to the missionary society and those